So we looked at the worst NBA GM moves in recent memory. Now here's the best. And a few things I have to point out. By recent memory, I'm talking about the last 5 years or so. I wanted to go back even further, but there's just so many GM moves in general, I had to keep it more recent. And I should also point out that even though there were a few I wanted to mention, I'm not going to name off every great move from the draft, because there's just too many, so I kept it limited. And last thing, keep in mind, a terrible trade that I mentioned last video probably means it was a really good one for the other team, and I'm not going to mention it in both videos. So if you feel I missed out on anything, make sure to go check out that other video if you haven't already. But okay, with that said, let's get into it. And I think it makes sense that we start out with the most recent of the best GM moves in recent memory, and that's the James Harden trade. I talked about it in my last video how this may have been the biggest NBA trade we've ever seen. And it was also extremely rare because I felt it was a situation where every single team came out as a winner. The Nets got Harden and got to keep Spencer Dinwiddie. The Rockets stayed in the playoff picture and got future assets. The Pacers aged down and got a player with a higher ceiling, and the Cavs got a young star in the making. It was a great move for everyone, and like I said, that rarely happens. I don't think it's ever happened in a 4-team trade. But let's not forget about the D'Angelo Russell for Andrew Wiggins trade. Now straight up, the Wolves probably would have won this one. But this was just a great GM move by the Warriors, because if you consider the fact that Golden State already had a point guard, they had no use for a younger one. So they swapped him for a young small forward where their lineup was lacking. But not only that, they also got the Wolves 2021 draft pick. It's top 3 protected and the Wolves have been terrible, so there's a chance Minnesota keeps it, but there's also a chance Golden State gets the 4th or 5th pick in the draft this year. So it should make you realize that this was a pretty good move for them. I mean, you combine that with the fact that they were able to get the number 2 pick in last year's draft, and now they have another chance for one in the top 5. And their GM really deserves some props, because now one of the best NBA teams when healthy is going to have a former 1st overall pick, a former 2nd overall pick, and they could either get a top 5 player, or they even have the assets to try and move up in the draft. So it's a good move, assuming it's not a top 3 pick. And I also wanted to mention Kawhi and Paul George joining the Clippers. Now, last video I said that I think that they may have given up too much for PG, and that made it one of the worst trades, and that may be true, but still, in the big picture, the fact that the Clippers were able to bring in arguably 2 top 10 players in the NBA within a day of each other overall makes both moves combined one of the best. So the Paul George trade by itself, one of the worst. Combine it with the Kawhi move, and it's one of the best. Because that just doesn't happen. The team looked like they were headed towards mediocrity after they just kept losing their best players, but completely changed the narrative within 24 hours. And the only way Kawhi said he was going to join them was if they brought in another star, and they made that Paul George trade work. So I mean, in a way you could say they gave up Shea and those 5 picks for Kawhi and PG, which is why I think it makes things so much better. I mean, it's not every day you get to make your team instant championship contenders. Another one of the best NBA GM moves goes to the Nuggets GM for his ability to scout talent and draft players, because over the past 7 years since 2013, they've drafted Rudy Gobert, Nikola Jokic, Jamal Murray, Donovan Mitchell, Michael Porter Jr., traded for Bol Bol on draft night, and picked up RJ Hampton. Okay, sure, they traded away both Donovan and Gobert on draft night too, but they at least get some credit for being the ones that drafted them. I mean, imagine how good they'd be if they hadn't traded them away though. But even though they did, it shows why they're as good as they are today, because they know who to pick and aren't afraid to take chances on players. And speaking of that brings us back to one of Danny Ainge's many great moves as a GM, when in the 2017 NBA draft, the Boston Celtics had the 1st overall pick. The top teams drafting that year all wanted Markelle, except for Boston. So they traded back with Philly for the 3rd pick and a future 1st round pick, and as we know, that gave the 76ers Markelle, and Boston got Jason Tatum. So once again, the Celtics made another great move that set them up for a long time. They got the best player out of the draft that year, while Philly ended up with pretty much nothing but a struggle out of picking Fultz. Then we got to give some props here to both the Lakers and the Nets for the trades they made revolving around D'Angelo Russell. So D'Angelo started out on the Lakers, but eventually they were ready to move on from him. So they traded him and Timofey Mozgov's terrible contract to the Brooklyn Nets. And it seemed like the Nets won this one at first, but it didn't end that way, because LA got Brook Lopez and the pick that would become Kyle Kuzma, who's still got a bright future, but it also cleared Mozgov's contract so that they could sign LeBron and eventually trade for Anthony Davis. So they had to lose out on a future star, but cleared up cap space for a championship team. And who knows, if they don't find a trade for Russell and Mozgov, maybe they never sign LeBron and Davis. And as for the Nets, well, they helped develop Russell into a star, and then were able to trade him in the sign and trade used to get Kevin Durant, which has led them to getting Kyrie Irving, which led also to James Harden. So in the end, definitely a win for both. And speaking of that Anthony Davis trade, that was another win-win and definitely a great move by LA and the Pelicans, because the Lakers had the best player in the game, but he was playing playing with all these young players and they weren't a good team, while the Pelicans had Anthony Davis playing with nobody and he had wanted a trade for a while. So both teams fixed their problems. The Lakers got Davis and won a championship, while New Orleans got their own star in Brandon Ingram, Lonzo Ball, who could have been good, Josh Hart, and don't forget they still have 3 future first round picks from LA. So it set up their future brighter than it ever was with Davis. The Miami Heat and their GM also deserve some credit too, because they were in a weird position a couple years ago, until they got Jimmy Butler, the star of their team, through a trade where they only had to give up a first round pick, Josh Richardson, and Hassan Whiteside's expiring contract. A first round pick is good, Josh Richardson's a good player but not a star, and Whiteside's expiring deal they had been trying to get rid of for a while. So they couldn't have gotten a better deal for Jimmy to team him up with their younger talent, which it's also no coincidence how they got all of them, because it was simply more fantastic GM moves here. They signed Kendrick Nunn and Duncan Robinson, who both went undrafted, and drafted Hero and Bam later in the draft at 13th and 14th. It was no coincidence Miami made it to the NBA Finals last year, it was just a combination of great GM moves culminating all at once. And let's not forget the fact that the Portland Trailblazers took a chance on Carmelo Anthony when nobody else would, and that turned out to have been a smart decision. He really transformed this Blazers team and is a great fit for them. He was last year as a starter, and now this year he's the perfect fit off their bench. And as we've seen, it's even small moves like this that can really change a franchise around. I also thought the Chris Paul trade to the Suns was a great one, because Phoenix really only had to give up Kelly Oubre, Ricky Rubio, and a first round pick to get him. After seeing how great CP played for OKC, I did think his trade value would have been a little bit higher than that. And it's like the Suns didn't even want Oubre anymore after seeing how well they played without him, so they were going to trade him anyways and only had to give up one extra pick in Rubio for a superstar level player. And that was great to see. Plus, seeing how Kelly's played this season, they obviously made the right move here. And it may not look like it right away with the Atlanta Hawks and all the moves that they made in 2020, because all 3 of Rondo, Danilo, and Bogdan have gotten injured to start this season. But they're all in Atlanta on multi-year deals. They're going to have these guys for years to come, and the Hawks still aren't great, but these were the perfect moves to set them on the right path. And for Atlanta's GM to be able to attract 3 of the better free agents this past offseason shows why this was one of the best GM moves in recent memory. And while speaking of Trae Young, I should also give a quick mention to one of the best possible moves that was made by the Mavericks when they traded up for Luka Doncic in return for him in 2018. But I also want to make sure I give props to the Utah Jazz's general manager for the moves they've made over the past couple of years. There's not a standout one in particular, and Rudy Gobert's max contract definitely isn't in there, but signing Bojan Bogdanovic away from the Pacers, trading Dante Exum, who was a bust, for Jordan Clarkson, who's now averaging around 20 points per game off their bench, and making that Mike Conley trade for Jay Crowder, Kyle Korver, and a first, were all moves that when combined show why they deserve to make it in today's video. And the last one for today goes to the Toronto Raptors for being able to trade DeMar DeRozan and getting Kawhi Leonard in return. Sure, it was for only one season, but yeah, I'd much rather win a championship for 1 year than be an above average team for the next 5. And plus it worked out anyways, because Toronto's still been a good team since then. Now, like I said, there were a ton of trades, drafts, and signings over the past 5 years or so there's a good chance I may have missed some. I didn't expect to find every single one of them, so if there was any that I missed, comment them down below so you can add them onto this video. Drop a like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you next time.